that Pierre Hadot makes. On the one hand, he insists over and over again that philosophy is a way of life. So when Socrates engages with a dialogue, for example, like Phaedo, rather than making statements about whether something is true or not, whether some piece of information is accurate or not, he is really trying to figure out how to have a good life, how to live well, how to live properly, how to live ethically, how to live that is appropriate to our finite existence. So we'll talk about the specific implications of that. And then the second claim that I ask in the paper topic related to the first one is that it's an exercise of death. And that means something specific here. Of course, it sounds a little bleak. It sounds a little bit depressing at first sight, but it actually says something about how we should live our lives and why that would be a good life. So what I want to start with is at the beginning of Phaedo, Socrates is now about to be executed, about to be killed. And he has this dialogue with his friends. And of course, rather than looking at this as a sort of proper recording of what happens, this is Plato's attempt to explain what Socrates' life is about. Now, of course, this is, I mean, it is a dramatic dialogue too, because Echecrates is telling this story or starts the dialogue, and Phaedo is telling the story. Therefore, the name of the dialogue is Phaedo. Of course, Plato wrote this dialogue, right? But also he says, who was there? And he says, Plato was not there. So he referring to himself in the dialogue, saying that the one who wrote the dialogue was not there. Which, why would somebody do that other than being cute? Why would somebody says like, I'm writing a play in which I refer to myself about a set of events or a dialogue, but I also say I wasn't there. He was ill, he says. Plato was ill. Any thoughts? Yes, Charlie.
Could it maybe be to present the story as more credible and outside the view and bias of a person who might have been there? That's the one thing that I can think of off the bat, but I don't know.
Okay, so we are trying to understand the dramatic gesture. Now, this dialogue probably didn't take place. This dialogue is a figment of Plato's imagination, in the sense that he sees Socrates in a certain way and he's idealizing Socrates. So just in terms of the dialogue, this is not a attempts to be a proper or accurate recording of the events that happened with Socrates. So he's idealizing Socrates. So he doesn't make any truth claims in terms of nobody is going to say, oh, since Plato wrote it this way, it must be true. In fact, he is revealing his hand, like intentionally, because I mean, people reading this, oh, Plato says Plato wasn't there, but Plato wrote it. That doesn't make sense. So by trying to erase the, yes, Jared.
Do you think he could feel like he was living vicariously there?
Living vicariously through.
Yeah, maybe he has this like connection with like Socrates somehow.
Absolutely, that's true. Yet, I mean, he already wrote the dialogue. I mean, he already writes the dialogue in which we obviously know that he's very enamored of Socrates. But why does he insert himself? And then why does he try to erase himself? If you really want to erase yourself, don't even put it there. Why do you even like present it as if it is objective? And so, yeah, Olivia.
I feel like it could possibly be a disarming gesture. Like, I feel like if the dialogue opens with him saying, I wasn't there, then instead of spending the dialogue going, did this really happen? What are the sources on this? You can kind of just forget about that, know that it's sort of fictionalized, and then just engage with the ideas without this concern about sourcing.
Okay, good. Then, so, okay, let's put that as a question, like he does that, right? And then he's just sitting there, and which is interesting to those of you who might not have studied Plato very much in the past, is he starts writing poetry, which is almost very problematic for Plato, because Plato, as you know, in the Republic, or as you might know, or you should know, he sort of banishes the poets from the city. Like poetry is just making up stuff. So it's terrible. They should not have a place in the city. But that's kind of ironic, because his writing is poetic. His writing is dialogue. So he's sort of engaged in this double gesture. So whenever you make claims about Plato, which is merely assertive, like Plato had the four ideas, or Plato did this, Plato said this, that's almost always wrong. Now, why? Because rather than associating that with the opinion of a person or at the position of the proposition of somebody makes, he is trying to push you to think the ideas rather than whether those ideas belong to him or not. It doesn't matter whether Plato believes it or not, because he almost never speaks out of his own voice. He almost always speaks with Socrates, and we always associate Plato's voice with Socrates because he's his main character, but he's not Socrates. And he never really also just says this is what Socrates said. Like if you are a fan of somebody, you would sort of say, oh, you know, he said this, she said that, etc. But he almost always puts us into this. He said Phaedo was there, Phaedo heard it. Now Phaedo is telling to Ecrates, and the dialogue is actually a dialogue between Ecrates and Phaedo. Socrates is like twice removed from the scene. It's hearsay of an hearsay. What Plato is writing is the hearsay of an hearsay. So what he's trying to do is perhaps to distance himself from these being statements of facts or statements of truth or claims to be logically and properly correct. Now, this becomes, to me at least, pretty clear when he says, what is the definition of death? Now, how does he define death? In Phaedo.
Separation of the soul from the body.
Exactly. This is on page 101, section 64C. Is there anything else than the separation of the soul from the body? Yeah, maybe. I mean, is that like a definition of that, like by someone who predicates the entire apology on the basis that he doesn't know what death is? Why should I be afraid of something I don't know? Why would I be afraid of something I don't know? Wouldn't that be presumptuous in my fear to be afraid of death if I claim that I know what I'm talking about? So what is happening here? And so is that, do we believe that it is this, namely that the body comes to be separated by itself from the soul, whatever that means, and the soul comes to be separated by itself apart from the body? Is that anything else than that? No, that is what it is. So if you read this, you're like, oh, I know what death is now. My soul is going to be separated from my body. Isn't that like a wonderful definition? Cool. Like, hey, you know, what's going to happen after we die? Well, our souls are going to be separated from the body. What is he talking about? What kind of a definition is this? I mean, do you believe it? Like, is that it? Because you need to believe that there's a soul, and then he has all these like aspects of it that immortality of soul, etc. Rants, yeah.
So quick question. When we reach, I guess when we die, is that when we reach absolute freedom? I'm guessing. Is that something he's trying to say?
That might be, sure. freedom from our bodies. Except that would be also like the end, like maybe that would be end of our souls too. Because they make that claim, they ask him like maybe like soul is something like a air or breathing, and then it disappears and poofs, you're gone. Yeah, so
I mean, so the claim that the death is the soul separating from the body almost feels more like kind of an axiom from which the rest of the discussion proceeds, but I don't really feel like that claim, like that everything else is meant to be interrogated here, but I feel like that claim needs to be kind of the bedrock and can't really be broken down, because then everything else that happens is thrown into question.
well, yes. So are you suggesting we shouldn't, or are you just indicating that?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff here, and I think that we would potentially lose some of it if we got too caught up in this concept of death. But I also, like, personally, I don't believe it, but I'm willing to go with it for the sake of this dialogue.
Well, that's an interesting position. Okay, so is this kind of like a scientific attitude? Like with the axiom, you need to have an axiom. If you question the axiom, yes, everything else he says would be problematic. But if what he says, everything else depends on this the axiomatic truth, then how can we accept everything else he says if we can accept this? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I do, but I think that, like, I mean, I like, let me see here. Yeah, so like, immediately, like, he claims this, and then the person he's having the discussion with, who I think at that point is Simius, is just
Mhm.
like, no, yeah, that sounds good, and then they never come back to that. I mean, I haven't finished the entire thing, but for quite a long time, at least, they don't come back to that claim.
no,
So,
they
like,
never come back to it. No.
yeah. So I don't know. Like, I feel like, yeah, it almost is kind of like a science thing where it's like, okay, we're gonna make some suppositions, and then we're gonna do a whole thing. We're gonna have a whole dialogue, and you kind of have to go with that initial supposition.
Okay. Um. Okay. Let's just maybe like for the time being, maybe another 5-10 minutes. Let's just say we question that axiom, not because we are going to reject it, but what kind of an axiom that is. So he presupposed in this axiom the separability, but not only the separability, but the separation of the body and the soul, that, whatever he means by the soul is perhaps not even clear to us in terms of Greek conception of the psyche. But how do we read this statement? I mean, if we read this axiomatically and believe that this is true, then we have a lot of problems, because it seems to me at least a little bit difficult to accept. But rather than reading this as a theoretical statement about what death actually is, I don't know what death is. I can assume something like this, but not in order to make a propositional truth about that's death equal either true or false. If I accept this, how do I live my life? Is this a precept to how to live your life rather than to be a correct statement? Even if this is false, and as far as we can know from our perspective, as long as we are alive, it cannot be wrong. It cannot be wrong in the sense that the moment that you are supposed to verify this statement, you are already dead. You cannot verify anything. So that's the kind of paradoxical aspect. But maybe this is a precept about how we should live our lives. If we operate with this principle without assuming it is true or false, how do we operate with this assumption? So this is one way of maybe even understanding to kind of Phaedo is obviously one of those dialogues that really contributes to the intellectual bedrock of monotheistic religions, in which your body after your death is going to be either punished or rewarded, etc. This whole conception of how we approach life, how we should live. Now, of course, this is not a religious but philosophical precept about how we should live. So what happens? What is Socrates' point about what philosophers do, given we not accept as true, but accept as a proper precept about how we should live our lives? What do philosophers do? What does body represent? What does bodily desires represent for us? What does life mean? Yes, bless it.
Bodily desires are beneath the philosopher, like we're more interested in preparing the soul for death. That's
Sure,
how
I
I
think sounds a
understand.
little too pretentious. Let's just say, like, what is wrong with our desires? I mean, I have bodily desires, you all do. I mean, are these philosophers kind of like, you know, obnoxious in telling us how to live? Yes.
So the claim seems to be that the problem with bodily desires and also bodily perceptions is that they cloud absolute truths. Like, the body can't know things like justice, piety, good, health, strength. Like, you can't hold that in your hand, and therefore, like, the body is a sort of mechanism of lying that you kind of need to separate the soul from, so that the soul is prepared to learn actual absolute truth.
Sure. What do you think about that? Is it like, what kind of a statement is that? I mean, I personally find that like, so what? I mean, who do you think you are that you are going to have absolute knowledge anyway? I mean, we live in the 21st century, the century of absolute pleasure and personal, you know, satisfaction and desire. And to us, maybe this should, I don't know. I mean, I want to know what you think. Like, doesn't that appear a little bit too pious, too self-righteous, too earnest, too cheesy, too like, what am I gonna do? I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat, I wanna have sex, I wanna have like money, and I wanna pleasures of life. What else is there?
This is probably going to sound a bit like a joke, but I don't think it is. I have had proper conversations about this. There's a modern phrase right now called post-nut clarity.
What?
There's this modern phrase right now called post-nut clarity, which basically says that once a person has like an orgasm, you know, they have this kind of mindset that kind of leads them into very objective, and you know, it leads people to make the right choices instead of being driven by sexual desires, you know. And it's kind of similar to what Olivia was saying about you know, by not, for instance, having sex, you know, we can have this understanding of truth and knowledge that we might not be able to achieve if we are driven by bodily desires, for instance.
I'm not sure I fully understand it, but do you like, yeah, what does that mean?
It's basically trying to say that if one can, give me a few minutes, I need to readjust my thoughts.
Okay, you can write it down too, like on the chat, because that will help me.
I
So,
feel like it makes sense. It's kind of the same thing as like, if you're really hungry, then you wouldn't be able to think clearly. So it's like, to a certain extent, we have to satisfy our bodily desires in order to like even start on the more philosophical, trying to find a real truth thing. That's what it makes me think of anyway.
Okay, so that sounds good, but then this says only the body and its desires cause war. Civil discord and battles, for all wars are due to the desire to acquire wealth, and it is the body and the care of it to which we are enslaved, which compel us to acquire wealth, and all this makes us too busy to practice philosophy. I mean, I'm not like, I practice kind of maybe sometimes philosophy, like, but I find this like problematic in the sense that, like, what should we deny our desires? Should we, you know, think that our desires are bad? This actually kind of leads to the sort of Christian worldview, like everything about the world is about fallenness, sin, terrible body makes these sins, like, you know, mostly like they are preoccupied with sex and not having it, etc. And then everything detached from this is virtue, wonderful, etc. So that means a very straightforward interpretation of Phaedo as standard Christian worldview.
I mean, yeah, I kind of hate this idea wherever it pops up, just because I feel like, I don't know, I feel like a huge part of being, like most of being human, is the pursuing and fulfilling of different desires, and just like experiencing certain things. Like, fuck, like I love just like eating good food. Like that's one of the main reasons that I enjoy being alive, right? And it's not like, I don't feel at least that I'm like failing to prepare for death or my journey and the after. Like I just kind of feel like, okay, I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm gonna enjoy it if I can. But I'm also interested to hear like people expand on how what's being presented here differs from something like Calvinism or other interpretations of asceticism, because like I feel like they're so separated in time and space that I feel like there have to be key differences that I'm missing.
You're good. Great. Very insightful. So is this just a standard, like, you know, bodily desires are bad, you should not like sin actually, and only contemplate profound things, and that's what you should do, like that's the philosopher's life, and if you want to be a philosopher you should be like that? Yes, Kate.
I mean, I don't think the statement is being made that it's necessarily bad to indulge in bodily desires and needs. I mean, because I think Plato has made clear in other dialogues that just not everybody is like cut out to be a philosopher. Not everybody should even really necessarily try to be a philosopher at some point in their life. So I think what is more being said here is that for those few who are the philosophers, like bodily things and suffering do get in the way of finding truth. And that not necessarily that they're bad, but they do obfuscate what is being looked for.
No, that's a good observation. Definitely philosophy is not something that he democratically argues for everybody, but he also makes a judgment. There's also a form of judgment here, that this is a good life. It's not just a life, but this is a good life. So regardless whether you yourself exercise that or not, we can still evaluate as to whether that's a good life or not, because you might, like, you are also a human being, like potentially everybody suffers from these predicaments. So for us, it is different to read this post-Christianity, post-monotheism, as opposed to pre-monotheism, pre-Christianity when this was written, because, and I don't mean Christianity, of course, Islam is also pretty much in the same way. So we somehow, moderns, have a kind of, at least question, if not flat out rejection of this hate of the body. It's like, why do we have this kind of negative conceptions of our body, embodiment, etc.? Why is that? And why is that not a good life?
I think one thing I want to like kind of hit on is like I definitely get that the judgment is being passed that the philosopher's life is kind of the good life, but just because something isn't a good life, I don't think necessarily means it's a bad life. Like there's like that binary of like, okay, this either is good or this is bad. You're either living right or you're living wrong. Like I think that you can kind of, I don't want to say like you're living a neutral life, but you're never existing quite on good or bad. I don't know. Like I don't think that Plato would say that the common man, like, well, maybe, is fundamentally bad. They just don't have the capacity to be good.
That's what he believes, yes. And I'm not really saying judgment of the people. You're right. But it is the judgment of this body, claim that only the body and its desires cause war. So that's a judgment of the body. One person might choose to live according to those desires, and you might not judge them as a bad person or something like that. But that in and of itself, desires cause war. Civil discourse and battles, for all wars are due to the desire to acquire wealth. And it is the body and the care of it to which we are enslaved, which compel us to acquire wealth, and all this makes us too busy to practice philosophy. So when you ask the question, so Olivia, I'm gonna pick on you for a second now, okay? So like if somebody's desire to eat good food causes civil war, civil discord, battle, etc., right? Because that one who could argue something like that, namely, whatever we define life in terms of pleasure is actually the result of war. I mean, sorry, I'm just picking an example. I mean, I eat good food too, so I'm not judging you. But if I say like I fulfilling certain of my desires, I am actually creating injustice. That's really the question, like having a pleasurable life. Not personally, I mean, I don't think I'm doing anything, but what if the conditions that allow me to have that pleasure in life is always happening at the expense of other people, to the extent that it causes civil discord? Like, is it really like, can't we all enjoy our bodies? Is it always at the expense of other people? Yes, Kate.
Why do you not take it personally? Like, you made the comment, like, you don't think that you personally, like, contribute necessarily to that larger system of injustice. Like, why is it not on the responsibility of the individual for the way in which you feed into the system?
Oh, it absolutely is. I mean, but
Okay.
But that's if you choose to, because nobody's going to do this for you. Nobody's going to say, oh, you are eating too much shrimp, people are dying, we are going to kill you. That doesn't happen. So it is always a personal responsibility.
Okay.
That appears to be neutral to me. I mean, I don't know, shrimp. What is a more like luxurious food that I can eat? Like, I like to eat, I don't know, whatever. So that's kind of idea. And then that some people in Europe in the 17th century actually said, well, the whole economy is actually based on people going beyond their needs and doing some luxurious items that get the economy going, that you're actually contributing with your little desires, that, you know, you are creating jobs for people or something like that. So this is only personally you can ask. You can ask it socially in the sense that, oh, you are eating too much shrimp, right? Yes, Olivia.
I mean, I'm like an old school communist, so it's kind of our whole thing to believe that desires can be universally fulfilled without sort of the sacrifice of other people.
Good part. So then we have to make a really important distinction between needs, whatever that is, and desires. Because philosophical schools after Socrates really tried to make that, because nobody can deny needs, and that would be foolish and stupid and beyond like a pale to like deny needs. right? So I need to eat. Nobody is going to say, be a philosopher and don't eat. But this critical question of how certain of our needs become, or certain of our desires become needs. And that's a much more complicated question than a simple binary opposition, because what do you really need? Need. Then the question is for what? In order to survive, you need to eat. You probably need to stay indoors to the extent that is possible. You need shelter and food. What else do you really need in being alive? Yes.
I mean, I think psychologically you need the ability to fulfill certain pleasures and desires. Like, I think that that's an important part of human health and sanity. Like, I think that if you don't have the ability to pursue the things that you're passionate about, that you desire, things like that, then life is sort of just this, like, life is machine maintenance.
Well, is that very different than the desires? Because if our desires are also manufactured the way in which certain machines are manufactured, then are we really getting away from that by satisfying our desires?
Sorry, would you clarify what you mean by that?
Well, you said, like, if you just live in order to survive and stay alive, that doesn't is necessarily satisfactory psychologically for fulfilling certain of our ambitions, desires in life. But then the question is, how much of it is natural? How much of it is necessary? How much of it is produced? How much of it is at the expense of other people? How much of it is completely artificial? And this is really the questions, and that's the only thing that I learned from Phaedo in terms of exercise of death, is to be able to separate what counts as body and what counts as soul. Now, we might satisfy the needs of our body, but isn't there a simple pleasure of just living according to the basic needs of your body? Because especially this is, to me, incredibly important in the 21st century, because most of our desires are created for us. Like, my sort of go-to example of this, like our needs for cell phones. Like, do we need it? Do we need it? Was it a need? Do you see it as a need now, to the extent that if you don't have it on your pocket, if in your pocket when you are leaving the house, you feel empty? Then the question is, you can choose. You say, this is my need and I'm going to fulfill it. This is not a desire. I'm not going to kill anybody. Well, you kind of did. If it is an iPhone, you already participated in a lot of injustices, etc. But this is the questioning attitude in terms of how to live a good life. Namely, is it good that I satisfy that need, satisfy that desire, or is it a better life not to have that desire? Because with a cell phone, like, the desire is never satisfied. You get one, and then you need to get another one. And it gets old, and you can't update it, and it becomes stale. And then that desire never really satisfies a need. Like, when I eat, I'm fine. I eat, finished. After I'm full, I don't say, oh, I need more shrimp now. I just ate bread. I'm full. That's a need. It's fulfilled. This is my basic need of the body. It needs to eat. Everybody should eat. As a basic communist, you should say, like, people should not be hungry because it's a need. Well, should everybody have a cell phone? Should everybody have a computer? Should everybody have desires like that they can fulfill? Should everybody? Okay, I'm not even sure why I'm talking about shrimp. Find me something luxurious. Yes, bless it.
But like, isn't that like the very like nature of needs that you'll never be able to like fully satisfy them? Like, even when you go to something like hunger, you will be hungry now and then eat, then you'll be hungry later again. And the same way that like I will need my phone now, and then when it becomes stale and something else, I'm going to need another one. So like, isn't it just like how needs are? Like you can never completely satisfy something and be like, okay, I'm done with this need. I don't need to satisfy it again.
Okay, good question. I mean, good. I mean, you are sort of questioning the clear distinction between need and desire. Why is it that food is an acceptable need, but not having a cell phone? Like, to me, that's an interesting question, because I lived first 30 years of my life without a cell phone. I was happy, maybe. Maybe that was a better life. I mean, it was. So then the question is, what would be a good life? Like, I mean, that's sort of our relationship to technology. So, oh, it's great. Now I have a cell phone. And then I remembered, okay, this is really embarrassing. I'm not going to tell it as my daughter, but imagine some person, like you buy them a phone for the first time at Christmas, and this person is like shaking with joy from receiving their first cell phone. Like, oh my God. And it's like, is this natural? Is it a need? Is it happiness? Or are you making that person unhappy for the rest of their life? Yes.
I feel like the cell phone these days has become almost like another body part of ours, like how the stomach gets hungry, or like your body gets sleepy or something, and it's just like another like basically piece of us that is room for desire. And I think since you can have desires through your phone with like different apps like TikTok or Facebook, Instagram, all these different like desires that we can now have through the phone that don't really necessarily have to live, but you need to have. You think for your like serotonin levels, people's brains just get like so like flushed now because of these phones, where they have to like run off the phones almost. And I think that's like it's like a whirlpool of desire. Like it just sucks you into it and you like swimming around in it.
No, there's a lot of research on that. Obviously, I'm sure that you come across to that. A lot of books like how we are trying to empty a void, or this is the kind of why it's impossible to be philosophical in the moment of technology, because it's based on like creating and feeding that emptiness, etc. But I want to approach, okay, so we'll come back to this and we'll discuss that a lot. I think we should, but I want to frame the dialogue for us, at least in terms of this separation of the body and the soul. In terms of this, he assumes a kind of stability, peacefulness with the soul. He says all the change, problems, desires, discord, war come from the body. For us, that is the question of what is it if we assume, for the sake of the argument, so there is a distinction between these two that will actually be actualized in the moment of death. Is his understanding of the soul, how can we think of his understanding of the soul? Is that a proper way of thinking? Is it only the body? And because he also assumes a kind of stability for the body too. What does body need? Like, you know, people even make like this pyramid of needs and stuff like that. I'm sure that some of you came across in some of your classes. Who is that guy who does that, like the Marlowe or whatever?
Maslow?
Maslow.
Maslow, yes, not Marlowe, Maslow. So it's like, you know, basically it's like food, blah, blah, and then it goes up, etc. It's like, oh, that's also like, you can really demarcate that once and for all. What do we need? Food. It's like, you know, water. Okay, that's because we are organic bodies. And then what else needs? Social needs, like friendship and love and blah, blah. So are those also stable, or is it much more dynamic, especially because if a phone, as you say, can be thought as an extension of my body, which a lot of people now start imagining it, how can we make this distinction once and for all properly, like the body and the soul? And even if we do we know what belongs to the soul and what belongs to the body? Does that make sense as a question? And is it always possible to say that body is the discord, body is the war, and soul is the peace? Or is soul here just a metaphor for peacefulness? Not because the soul itself is peaceful, but the more you exercise and become peaceful, you are cultivating the soul. And your soul might not be peaceful. So anyway, so these are the kinds of questions. We'll read that a little bit. So he says, he says, all things will necessarily make true philosophers believe and say to each other something like this. This is on page 103. Because as long as we have a body and our soul is fused with such an evil, we shall never adequately attain what we desire, which we affirm to be the truth. So I'll read that as a little bit of a judgment, like the evil, like that. Like, why is it that what is it evil consists of? And evil is not here in the sense of a sort of Christian sin evil, but it is the cause of our not good life. I read it like that, like makes our lives miserable, makes our lives unhappy, makes our lives not adequate to live. Okay, we'll come back to this because I want you to think about this, how we can read this dialogue today in a post-Christian world in which we are a little bit more suspicious about undermining our bodies, saying like, oh, it's evil, it's terrible, etc. So for Plato, maybe it is different in the sort of historical context because he doesn't have this practice of religious authority in the world, especially monotheistic religious authority in the world, and control of the social space and political space for centuries. So he doesn't have that. So for us, maybe it's a little bit more complicated, right? For us, it would be like how can I uncritically accept this if the acceptance of this has immediate consequences for my life? Okay, let's take a break about 10, 11, 12 minutes and then come back at 10:10. So why we are discussing what we are discussing in terms of Plato's distinction between the body and the soul, and claiming that a love of wisdom, a philosophical life, would be associated with the soul, and try to separate the soul from the body because of all the problems that the body creates for human beings and makes it more present to the material world. And you cannot really discern anything important or knowledge in terms of the material world. Now, of course, we need to somewhat connect this to what Heraclitus, for example, said about the material world. Things change. To the extent that they change, they never give you happiness, stability, etc. And you cannot know, of course, to the extent that you are present to the material world with your senses, with your desires, with your body, etc. And that's always going to change. And so practicing philosophy is finding that inner peace, the tranquility, maybe not, as Plato says, as a, I mean, I don't think he even says that explicitly, of course, but a kind of eternal peace, like death or something, but trying to find peace in the midst of this whole sort of turmoil that we are experiencing. Now, we can obviously look at it in two ways. One would make you, in a maybe distinctly Christian way, very judgmental in terms of, you can say, like, you are not allowed, or even you should not be allowed to enjoy your bodily pleasures. And that enjoyment itself in itself wrong. Or this is what I think Plato and Socrates is saying. This is not a question of judgment about how I judge your life to be, but it's more like, how do you want to live your life? So the whole premise of this is that rather than me thinking like, oh, if I eat whatever, some luxurious food, I'm hurting other people and I feel guilty and I want to, punish myself or something like that. But to what extent that my life becomes problematic, or at least not peaceful and unhappy or not good, to the extent that I pursue this, to the extent that I pursue these bodily pleasures. So do you see the difference there? Is there a difference, or does it end up being the same thing? So what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking about that in this sort of like, you have your desires, right? Your passions, and they certainly are the root of a lot of suffering, in the sense that you, I don't know, you become sort of dependent on them, and like they, yeah, this is like some sort of like a stoicism, I guess. Yeah.
Some sort of what?
Stoicism, like,
Okay.
like you shouldn't just give yourself to like your passions, and it sounds like religious also, but with a different connotation. Yeah.
Okay, so do we believe in that different connotation? Is there something like, without necessarily accepting this moral, judgmental aspect of religious life, in the sense that you are sinning, you are a sinner, you should be punished, or you will be punished, or something like that, or like in another life, etc., or just this life here, my life, my way of living becomes better, more peaceful, more acceptable, more, I don't know, I mean, for the lack of a better word, happy, but more in terms of living, in terms of love of wisdom, makes your life better. It's a better life. It's better not to have desires rather than being able to satisfy all your desires. It is better not to be living for the desires, living for the satisfaction of your desires, even though you might have some desires. Especially if you think about the specific desires that we have in the 21st century, which to me appears to be more and more dissociated from needs. Isaac, do you have something to say, or okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me like part of that might be simply avoiding the fear of death. Like on page 106, he's talking about how courage and moderation are kind of symptomatic of a fear of death, because if you're like absorbed with all your bodily pleasures, and death is the separation of the body and the soul, the only reason you'd be afraid of death is because you want to do stuff with your body. And so I think part of what he's saying might be that if we're just only consumed by the stuff that feeds our soul, then we won't fear death as much.
Sure. Yes. That's definitely what he thinks. Like, do you agree with that? But doesn't that assume he knows what death is?
Yeah, I don't personally agree, but I think, well, no, I don't think anything. Sorry.
Charlie?
I feel like I can't get away from the thought that just the whole elaboration on and creation of the idea of the soul just draws from an oppositional thought to the kind of discomfort that comes from the fact that we as humans feel as though our bodies aren't under our control, that we can't like that we do things that we hate, because you can't prove a physical existence of the soul, but you can prove a physical manifestation or just a sensory manifestation of doing things that aren't right. And I don't know, I like whenever just the discussion of this one is like, yeah, interesting, but could you focus?
You just muted yourself.
Oops. Would the focus on like just like the idea of like a mastery of your bodily function result in a more intimate relationship with this idea of the soul as you are able to develop more disciplined bodily, although you would need some sort of motivation, which maybe then that's where the soul comes into play. But if you can master your body and minimize these things that you hate, is there as much need for a soul?
Well, that's actually like you are answering your own question. I take that soul to be simply that kind of mastery, that kind of practice, rather than thinking of the soul as something. Because as soon as you read the sentence, the soul is the separation of the body from the soul and the soul from the body, that's the definition of death, then you realize that maybe soul is a thing, something. But it could be just that activity of, the way you put it is beautiful, because mastery of those bodily desires, which doesn't mean complete denial and rejection of those. Mastery means to be able to regulate that. So, I mean, philosophers, it's not like, oh, I'm like a monk, I don't do anything, I don't eat, I don't drink, etc. But there's a balance between denying something completely or being enslaved by them. That's really the sort of opposition that he's setting up here. And you use the term mastery, which is really cool. So you are either the master of your body or you are the slave to your body. No, neither of them. I mean, it's not like you are a pure master in terms of like, I can will myself not to eat. I can say like, I'm choosing not to get hungry. No, that's not a realistic sort of understanding of our embodiment. But on the other hand, I'm going to kill thousands of people in order to eat. That's a completely different thing.
Yeah, I think the Calvinism idea that I think Olivia just said, the word Calvinism, made me think of like people interpreting it as, in order to avoid something, I must make it evil, or like I don't want to indulge in it, I will make it something that is considered evil. But in doing so, you're giving it just as much attention as if you were having sex every day. Like it's not that, it's still taking up just as much of your kind of reality as if you were like extreme omission versus extreme commission. They're both achieving the same thing.
Yes, and later on after Plato, most people sort of try to interpret it as a sort of indifference, precisely in order to avoid your dichotomy, or like if you are obsessed in following them, you are as much implicated as if you are obsessed to avoid them. And that the better sort of balance is this notion of indifference. But what I would like you to think in terms of how to learn something from Plato and this dialogue is, what is it that you do that you really think is yours? Like, what is it that you think is your desire that belongs to you? Like, because most of the time, like this is just a purely anecdotal, so this is not a scientific evidence, but whenever I talk to people about social media, nobody says, oh, I'm addicted to social media. Everybody is like, oh, I'll just, whenever I want. I am mastered. Like, I'm not, like, Jared was talking about all this kind of statistic. I mean, we're not saying statistic, but a lot of people statistically demonstrated to be addicted. But I never meet them. They never exist in the sense that everybody is the master. They're like, oh, I just post to TikTok once in a while, and I don't really spend time on Instagram at all. It's just that I go once a day maybe or something. So everybody has this kind of recognition that they are thinking that they are mastering it, but as a society, we judge everyone else and say, oh, they are spending millions of times. They are spending the entire day on social media. I am in control. So that kind of expresses a desire, regardless whether you are in control or not, but you want to control it. You have that foresight or that understanding, but maybe you are telling to yourself that you are more in control than you actually are. Because, my daughter says, oh, I don't care about my phone. I mean, she's on it for like 8 hours a day. So, and I judge her, like, of course, that's my job. But I also have to judge myself in terms of, oh, I don't do it as much as anybody else, but I'm doing it too. So that's the question in terms of a good life. How much of my desires are actually my desires? Do I really want to eat shrimp because somebody told me that it was cool to eat shrimp? Am I going to spend the rest of my life chasing shrimp, or it's actually not even like that important to me? That desire is not really that compelling. I mean, I really don't need the next iPhone, but I'm not gonna, work 24 hours a day and waste my life in order to make money and to get that iPhone 12, whatever it is now, 13, 14. Yeah.
How could we reasonably claim to be able to separate what you desire because of external influence from what you desire from within, other than things that are like bodily imperatives? Like, I feel like our psychologies are all shaped by the society that we were raised in, so it's not like, I don't feel like there's some element of myself that's outside of 21st century, America. Like, I think I like things because I like them, but like, brought up in a totally different place at a totally different time, there would probably be an entirely different set of things. And maybe there's some essential quality that like ties those things together, but I'll never really know what that was.
That's an excellent observation and a great question. Precisely because of that, Socrates, or Plato, in fact, defines death as an exercise of death. Not like you can you kill yourself. I mean, that's not really the point, right? Of course, that exercise of knowing, trying to understand what really belongs to you and what doesn't. That's really the spiritual exercise. That's really the philosophical exercise. Precisely that question of knowing yourself. Now, you start with the premise like all of it is social. All of it is contextual. But they are not all the same. You do not accept all the aspects of 21st century. You are not like, I don't know, like you are not a Wall Street person doing cocaine and like doing like extravagant things, etc. So you do not accept everything. So understanding yourself, understanding what really belongs to me, what is really important to me, or even not, given that that's not always going to be the same, perhaps, but really this idea of knowing yourself precisely in that in between spaces, what really belongs to me, if anything, or am I 100% determined by the social forces that I'm a part of? So that's really the question. And I mean, all I can tell you is that, well, even in your question, there is the recognition that there's a difference. You don't accept everything. I mean, do you, like, I don't know, like, do you live with, like, you don't live like everybody else.
I mean, Wall Street's about half an hour away, so like if you have any cocaine, I can get there pretty easily. Like, I can get to that state.
Okay, but I don't, like, I hear that they are doing cocaine in order to be on top of things, etc. This is just like a stupid thing, of course. But yeah, that's the kind of, that's a life. That's a 21st century life. That's not what I'm determined by. And as a philosopher, there's a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of like recognition of a good living is that maybe I'm not as much dependent on certain things that other people are and making them unhappy. And maybe I'm not fearful of the same things, in the sense that a lot of people are, I don't know, like, just think for yourself. You go to college, you start. What are the fears, consciously or unconsciously, they are injecting into you? What are you afraid of? The most thing that you're afraid of probably is like graduating from college and not finding a job. That scares you. That's like horrifies you as a human being. Like what good am I? I'm gonna have like sort of doubts about my own existence. Like, I'm not good for anything. I'm useless. That's the fear that motivates me. That's the fear that determines what kinds of decisions that I make. Or is that really a fear? Or is it possible to take this fear out of the equation? Like, you know, yes, you might have difficulties in life, which everybody does, independently of their situation, relatively speaking. But what is it really a fear? Like, what is a real fear? And what is a manufactured fear? Yeah.
I think you can't really get rid of the fear without also getting rid of the desire to have a job.
Why not?
Well, because if you want a job, you're always going to be afraid that you're not going to get one. I don't know.
I mean, but that leads to the unrealistic expectation of like, you shouldn't get a job. You shouldn't have the desire to get a job, rather than seeing what kind of fear that is and motivates you. I think you can do both. You can get a job and not fear it. Because fear is that motivates you. Fear is pushing you to do certain things and saying no to certain things. And mostly those fears are not even your fears. Unfortunately, they are the fears of your parents. They are more fearful for you than maybe you are for yourself. They're like, oh, my son and daughter is going to be destroyed in life and blah, blah. And then you sort of internalize that fear. Yeah.
I think one problem that I face is that I've so internalized like the ideology of like success that like I fight my parents on this the other way around. Like, I'm like, I need to get a 4.0 and I need to like do this and this and this and you know, stay up late working. They're like, go to bed. It doesn't matter. Like, you're
Is
fine.
that what your parents say?
What?
Is that what your parents say?
Yeah.
See, bless their heart. That's why you turn out to be like that. Because if your parents, maybe you are sort of responding to their sort of perceived indifference. My daughters are exactly like that. I say like, let's cut the class. Let's not go to school. It's stupid. You don't have to like do this. Life is not only about competition, etc. I mean, it's early. It's cold. I don't want to go. I don't want to drive you to school. Let's just sleep in, etc. And they're like, no, get up. You have to go. And again, this is sort of, it all doesn't always like work one-to-one. Like your parents have the fear and then you have the fear, etc. It's really how you are responding to the situation, because my you know, my mother was a little bit like that too, and I didn't really care as much until I did. But my daughters are completely different. But that's, again, what is the fear for them? Like, what is it? You know, you can ask this to yourself, and then, what is my motivation? What is my fear? Why do I accept these things? And even asking that question, even thematizing it for yourself, is this exercise. Now, you shy away from this exercise because you anticipate a reason, you anticipate an answer. If I ask this question, there is either no answer or I don't even want to deal with it. And this is really the philosophical, think about this exercise. Like when you exercise, you are not going to like be completely, whatever the purpose of exercise until one exercise. You are not going to build that body, for example, until the 5th exercise. But exercise is really that kind of engagement, which he calls, Hadar does, which is very interesting, spiritual exercise. You don't do it just in order to achieve one end right away, but you do it as a way of life. And then most of the time we think of exercise like it's a paradoxical thing, right? Physical exercise. What are you trying to do? You are trying to be healthy. Well, you are all gonna die. Why do you exercise? It's not gonna keep you alive, but I want to live well. I want to have a good life. That's why I'm exercising. I'm not exercising to lose weight. I'm not exercising to, you know, do X, Y, Z. That exercise in and of itself makes me happy, makes me have a good life. And that's really the philosophical practice, living like that without this instrumental approach that I'm going to have an answer. But that very questioning is the healthy one. Not because you are going to decide these are societies, these are mine, but I need to ask that question in order to live well. I'm not living well if I don't raise that question.
So should we live fearless just as we should live desireless?
No, absolutely not. You should never be fearful. Like, you'll die in 5 minutes if you live like without fear. But I mean, then what is, like, it's always good to ask, like, what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of right now? What's my fear? And it's not sort of take a pill and forget about your fear or just like conquer all your fears or something like that, but how do I negotiate my fears with the world, really? So it's not really only a psychological question at all. Like, you know, when I drink, I'm not fearful. I shouldn't record this, but when I have a couple of drinks, I'm like incredibly like courageous, which is stupid, I guess. But I mean, I don't go do stuff, but like that's, it's not a psychological problem. It's an intellectual problem in the sense that I can understand what motivates me to do certain things in life. Like, you know, what I'm afraid of at Earlham, what I'm afraid of in my job, what I'm afraid of in life, who I'm afraid for. And is it real? Is it like, you know, I always had this image of like, I'm gonna live homeless under a bridge for the rest of my life as an utter failure. That's the fear.
Would you say that fears push you away from something and desires pull you towards something?
That would be an interesting way of formulating it. Sure, desire is always this stretching out for something out, like not being able to be one with yourself. But by the very term desire, from, again, Greek term, oregontai, to stretch out, like you go outside of yourself in order to attain something. So yes, it is pulling you someplace, and you cannot be one with yourself. And that's really like how we live our lives, especially in the 21st century. There, you are even encouraged, not even encouraged, but sort of almost compelled to like formulate your goals. What are you stretching for? What do you want make yourself? Which is like you come to college, you are worthless. You need to make yourself worth, because in and of itself, in yourself, you have no significance. You need to achieve certain things. This is how we understand human life. Just to be has no value. Like, then you are like nobody, meaningless. You need to accomplish something. What's your goal? At least make money. Your life otherwise has no value. And that's how we understand ourselves. That's why I'm never enough for myself. I'm constantly trying to be something other than myself. I'm trying to reach for something else. And yes, this is the same in the Greek society, where you are even more exposed to the public and you have a reputation and people say you are, oh, very courageous, very wise, very wonderful, etc. And Socrates says, I don't care. I don't care. And that pisses people off. It's like, how do you think, how dare you think that your life has a value beyond your social achievement? I don't value your life. And that's why this sort of, I always believe that's why people don't like philosophers, because they're like, who the hell are you? Like, how can you think that? How dare you? And they call them arrogant, etc. Like, of course, life is worthless, meaningless. You have to work and make yourself justify your even existence. Like, why the hell do you exist? You have no contribution to society, not successful. You're a loser. What kind of life is that? What kind of understanding of life is that? Like, what kind of understanding of existence is that? That as you are born, in and of itself, you are worthless.
I mean, I feel like it's a deeply sick one. Like, I think that,
I mean, yeah.
I don't know, like, I feel like the only way that you can really have compassion for other people is to have that compassion be unconditional and to recognize the inherent value in human life rather than tying it to some sort of achievement. And that probably sounds very crunchy granola to say, but
That sounds awesome.
That's what I feel.
Except in order to be able to actually value, I mean, why would I even value somebody else's life that I don't even value my own life as it is? I don't. I mean, it's like, unless I do something, I'm worthless. As existing as a being, you are worthless. And this is maybe even more stronger in terms of this work, this, like you brought up Calvin a couple of times, in terms of this Christian understanding. You are fallen. Your existence is a fallenness. You are down.
I guess I reject that idea fully. Like, I don't see myself as worthless no matter my achievements, and
okay,
same goes for everyone else.
So why do you give hard time to your parents? Why don't you just go to bed?
Mostly because I want to learn things, and we have this weird gatekeeping of knowledge in our society where we have to sort of like demonstrate aptitudes for certain things in order to get to learn a thing later. So
sure. So if you don't learn, you are not. If you don't learn, you are not good.
Or rather, no, it's I don't want to learn because I think it'll make me good. I want to learn because I'm curious.
No, I'm just asking again. This sort of, I mean, who am I to ask you this question? You should ask this question to yourself in terms of like you have certain motivations, and the presuppositions of that motivations is that maybe my life as it is now worthless. And I'm not saying that, oh, all your lives are wonderful, you are worthful, etc. That would be equally problematic. But that's how human beings approach their life. In terms of, and that's what Socrates is trying to do. What is a good life? What is a good life for me? What is a good life in society? How do I think of my relationship with other people in terms of good life? And how much of it do I think necessary? And how much of it is already answered for me, as you said, Olivia, in the 21st century, in terms of certain societal assumptions. And you can question them. You should question them. They suck. Most of them do. And you don't need to do that. You really don't need to do that. But this is easier said than done. It is an exercise because I'm saying this, but I'm going to say, oh, I'm a terrible teacher. Like
Can I make a distinction quickly? Because I feel like
Sure.
something's getting conflated here. Like, I'm not saying that, like, our lives don't suck. They do. But that doesn't mean that we don't have worth as people inherently.
I agree
Like-
with you, of course. But I guess, it's one thing to answer this question when you are confronted with it. But then you sit down and sit back and then say, how do I live my life that I'm living out this presupposition? Is it really my constant struggle to be something? Really motivated by this desire? If I don't, I'm worthless. And we do live in a society where, like, what is the purpose of political life? For 99% of the people today, the purpose of political life is to win. To win elections, to defeat your opposite. But why do I formulate political life like this? Why can't I think of political life and ability to live with others? Period. Not agreeing with everything, but an art of being able to coexist with people that I really hate sometimes. I mean, including myself. I mean, you can hate yourself too. I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But so could it be like nobody is going to win, nobody is going to lose? This is not the point of political life, not to win. Am I even capable of thinking of that when I'm confronted with other people whose position I think are absolutely wrong? Then I need to beat them because they are wrong. Yeah.
I feel like that's a sort of view of political life that assumes a sort of flattening of all power dynamics. That, like, we're not all just sort of these individual beings that are all in an equal playing field, and we all have different opinions about how we should live. Like, there are power structures that prevent huge swaths of people from being able to live in an even dignified way, and in order to attempt to right those wrongs, there needs to be a fight and a winning as a sort of intermediary step, not because like winning is the ultimate goal, but because by dismantling certain power structures, we can then actually give people dignity and give people lives that are not, maybe not good, but like livable at least. Like, I feel like the formulation of politics as sort of like a discourse that's less about winning and more about cooperation is only possible when everyone's on a level playing field.
I didn't say cooperation. I never used the term cooperation, but you're absolutely right. Now, then the question is, do you think, or do I think that I understand those power structures? Do I assume that in terms of my judgment, I understand how those power structures work? Do I know who oppresses who? How? Do you? I mean, sure, because people disagree even on that, right? But I know, and I'm going to you just said, it's an interesting expression, like you have to give dignity to those people. Everybody has to have dignity, sure. But like, how about in that very conception of winning, if we consider losers as undignified? Because you already defined people as undignified in terms of them being lost this power structure, which is fine. I agree with you. But does society even give me the tools and the correct perspective to understand what is wrong with our politics or what is wrong with our power structure? Do we even understand the power structures that we are so comfortably naming and judging? Do we understand how they work?
I mean, again, as a like an inherent axiom of my political ideology, I claim to, but it's a different perspective than I think most people, at least in the United States, have, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the right perspective. It's just what I think is correct.
Okay, I mean, I don't need to put you on the spot, or I don't need you to like sort of question you. You are the only one who is just saying stuff right now. But the issue here is really that question in terms of, am I like whatever my political, am I like ready to fight because I know what my team is and what my convictions are, and I understand what's the problem with the world? What if I'm the problem with the world? What if it's me? What if by trying to make the world a better place, like most, or like that's exactly what the president said today, like go make the world a better place, Earlham students, because that's your mission, right? So like, is it possible that maybe we are the problem? Is it possible in our absolute conviction that we are like wonderful in our understanding and ideas and compassion, etc.? We are really the problem? I mean, I don't believe that, but it definitely should be asked. Definitely more people should ask that. And then even the whole idea of hate and who I think to be the sort of exercising that power, do I even know who are the people who are in those positions of power? Do I hate, as I said last time, do I hate Apple? Or do I hate the person who is living there with a Trump sign? Am I supposed to work against that person with the Trump sign, or against Apple who says Black Lives Matter? Which Apple, by putting the sign of Black Lives Matter, actually destroys more Black lives than that person might ever do. That's what I don't know. This is my sort of why you say curious. That's exactly why I'm curious, precisely because that requires, yes, learning. That requires an exercise of not satisfying your desires, but working for what the question of justice is. Okay, that started sounding preachy, so let's cut that. Okay, so I mean, of course, it's Socrates. What can I do? So that's what he's saying. So this is like Plato's approach in terms of like desires and how we exercising that, not denying these desires like some Christian conceptions might think, but it is more like an exercise to be able to live with those desires without necessarily living the life for those desires. And most of them, I mean, this is what I think. I mean, when you get older a little bit, you sort of see how certain desires are manufactured. Namely, they didn't exist before, now they do. And I'm sort of like, I need this. No, I don't. I really don't. It is a pure need that somebody somehow put in my head. Which, if the entire economy is based on the satisfaction of your desires, of course, that's not really a good thing to question those. Like nothing will happen to our society if everybody stops buying iPhones.
It kind of reminds me of the thing like in the wake of the like September 11th attacks when Rudy Giuliani got on TV and was like, go out and shop, like please, like get your credit card out, go buy shit, because like if we didn't do that, the economy was going to collapse.
Even George W. Bush said that. Yeah, go consume. That's good for the economy. Until the next recession, then, you know, I don't know. And we do have some kind of built-in fascination with people who do. So we do have some kind of created or manufactured sort of recognition and desire and liking of certain lifestyle, certain way of being. So yes, after Socrates, there were these like various schools of thought who took this question seriously of how the society tells us to live and how we can create alternative ways of being that is not completely taken up by these sources of society, which, as you read from Nietzsche, obviously, that really led to the demise of Greek culture, maybe precisely because of not being able to control these desires for power and then war, etc. And it does lead to the end of societies. And maybe after being in war for several decades, if not centuries, maybe that's the fate of the United States. I went to this talk when they said like nobody can guarantee the continuation of the United States as a United States. And apparently 1/3 of California wants to be independent of the United States. So yeah.
Yeah, we've got like 40 years left, probably. At most.
40? That's good. That I won't see it, but I want to see it, kind of, but anyway. So. You don't, Isaac?
At least not while I'm here.
I mean, I don't know, like if California decides to separate from the United States, like, does that really change a lot for me? I don't know. I will
It
never
changes
go.
a lot if there's a war.
Yes, that's true, but I never go to California. Like, I can't stand California. Might as well be another country. Is anybody from California here? Nobody? They don't come to Heartland America anyway. So.
They've already seceded from this class.
Okay, good.